Hey guys, so welcome to our first lecture in this series. I wanted to do this in a little bit of a different style, as you can tell, just due to the fact that we are going to be dealing here with more of an educational theme, and a little bit's going to get sacrificed in the way of entertainment and editing, and so I really wanted to prioritize being able to get this content out to you guys as efficiently as possible. And in this lecture series, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be starting a course here that's going to really take us into the depths of understanding religion and understanding comparative mythology, looking at different belief systems from all around the world, looking at human origins, looking at psychology, altered states of consciousness, and how all of these different things can help us to better understand religion and ultimately our place in the world. So I wanted to do this first lecture mostly as just a presentation to give us some context, to give us a sense of where it is we're going to be looking. One of the big problems that people face when they try to make sense out of religion or they try to understand these things is that we often divide science and religion, and we try to argue, well, science is over on this side, religion on this side, and we ought not to mix the two. But really, this whole lecture series is going to run in the face of that, where it's essential that we have a proper understanding of science and a proper understanding of what we now know physically about our world, and really integrating that in and using it to better understand religion, comparative mythology, and spirituality. And so what I wanted to do in this first lecture is just give you guys a sense of context to show you where it is these ideas come from and why it's important that we understand human origins and how that's so central to having a proper understanding of religion and mythology. So this very first image here, this is James Ussher, who in the 1500s used details in the Bible to pinpoint the creation of the earth to the entrance of the night preceding the 23rd day of October, the year before Christ, 4004. Now, this has become kind of a popular little fun fact that a lot of people like to point out, because it really shows the mentality that Europeans had right up into the 15 and 1600s regarding human origins, how, basically our understanding of where man came from and how life developed on this planet was mostly taken from the Bible and from Holy Writ. And a similar thing was true within Islam, right? When we look to the Middle East, Muslims relied on the Quran, and mythology was really the primary source material for understanding human origins. And this, of course, would change in later years to come. So one of the first major figures that we see who really starts to call a lot of this worldview into question is James Hutton. Now, James Hutton was a Scottish geologist, and he published a work called The Theory of the Earth, or an investigation of the laws observable in the composition, dissolution, and restoration of land upon the globe. Very long title. They loved to give their books big, long titles back then. But essentially, James Hutton was really the one of the very first, or actually, in fact, probably formally the first person to argue for a much older date for the Earth's origins than what the Bible literalists were suggesting. And he was really, in many ways, an advocate of what's now known as uniformitarianism. Now, the central idea here is that in around the 1500s, 1600s, there was a great deal of scientific ideas that were coming to the fore. Isaac Newton really better understood the motions of the planets. Galileo Galilei was looking through his telescope and discerning that the Earth was not, in fact, the center of the universe, right? A lot of new and exciting ideas were coming out in this time. And some people started to turn that scientific form of inquiry towards understanding the Earth and understanding landscapes. And one of the big things that came out of this was three competing views, and I've posted an image here that describes this: catastrophism, gradualism, and uniformitarianism. And essentially the difference here is that the big two that really played a big influence on European thinking in the 1600s was catastrophism and uniformitarianism. The catastrophist view of the Earth suggested that the Earth and its shape was the result of catastrophes, most especially Noah's flood. Noah's flood was attributed for many different things that we see within geology. All the different strata that we see in rock, this was understood to be layers of sediment that had settled down as a result of the flood. Massive geological roughness or canyons and erosion like the Grand Canyon, this was understood to be the waters of Noah's flood rushing down, right? And when we look at the earth and we see these broken up pieces of land, catastrophists really thought that this was, again, the result of Noah's flood, that this catastrophic flood had really upheaved the earth and created all of these different landmarks that we see. But there were a number of prominent scientists and thinkers, James Hutton, the first of which, who argued that, in fact, this was not the case, that it was not, in fact, a result of Noah's flood, but that it was instead the result of a very long and gradual process of change that was the result of forces of nature already present in the world. And this was really in many ways solidified or turned into a very professional form of scientific inquiry by Charles Lyell. And I want to play for you guys. This is a short little clip that was put together with Brian Cox, Professor Brian Cox. It talks about Charles Lyell's book, The Principles of Geology. Now, the title of his book originally, Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. And, the title is a great summary, very long title, but it explains that basically Charles Lyell was arguing that the geological changes that we see on the face of the earth was not the result of catastrophes like Noah's flood, but that was in fact the result of slow and gradual changes seen over time. And his primary source for this research was Mount Etna. He traveled to Mount Etna and spent quite a bit of time there researching the different geological features in that space. And here you can see in the very front title of his book, in the front cover of his book, he has this photograph of three pillars in the Temple of Serapis, and you can see these three pillars here. And I'll play this video for you guys so that you can understand why this is significant.
Richard, could you describe first who you are and what's your area of scientific expertise?
Well, I'm Richard Fortey. I'm a geologist and paleontologist, so I'm an expert on and study evolution of animals from fossils.
This is a series about inspirational scientists from history, so who have you chosen?
I've chosen Charles Lyell, who was a 19th century British geologist who transformed the scientific credibility of geology. He gave geology as a science a real scientific basis, the method of how we can understand the Earth and its history.
And if we go back to the start of the 1800s, what was the general picture of geology at the time, and how did Lyell transform it?
There was a previous view of the Earth as fixed, the continents as fixed. The frontispiece of Lyell's book shows the Temple of Serapis on the Bay of Naples. I've been there to have a look at it. It's one of the holy places in geology. The columns of the temple are limestone, and they've been bored by a marine clam, which makes a brown line all the way round. And Lyell could see that this indicated that that temple, built perhaps at sea level or near sea level, must have been both depressed for the clams to do their work and then elevated again to where it was today. In other words, the Earth wasn't fixed, it was capable of up and down motion. And nobody up to that point had begun to think about how, in scientific terms, how mountain ranges could be formed.
So if a well-read person, let's say Darwin, in 1830 sits down and picks up the Principles of Geology, Volume 1, the first Principles of Geology, what sort of experience would that have been? Is it a revelatory text in a sense? Is it radically different?
Lyell saw sedimentary processes now, and he saw how much sediment accumulated in a given time, and he realised just how much sediment there was if you piled all the geological successions that were known one on top of another. And you could do a crude estimate of how old the world was, and you would immediately go into millions, which is what Darwin needed in terms of time for animal evolution and plant evolution to occur. So Lyell made time available to Darwin, if you like, so that he could understand how organismic evolution could happen.
So really, Charles Lyell's work really made his arguments compelling, right? Because Charles Lyell was not just simply putting ideas out there, he was supplying evidence. He was looking at the features that we find on the Earth, looking at historical features, geological features, and saying, this doesn't make sense if the Earth doesn't change or if the Earth doesn't move gradually. And this really marked a significant change in European thinking, because here was scientific research that really backed the idea that the Earth was much older than Christian and biblical tradition had initially supposed. Now, of course, most of us are familiar, I would think, at this point with Charles Darwin. I mean, this is really the watermark point in terms of changing our thinking, right? Charles Darwin took a trip on the HMS Beagle, and you can see here's a map of all the locations they visited. He circumnavigated the globe, and Charles Darwin's ideas were actually relatively simple. It's remarkable how, in some sense, it's very difficult to understand evolution by natural selection, and yet when you understand it, it's astounding how simple it is. It's almost hard to think how this wasn't obvious and easily seen. You see, Charles Darwin was interested in seeing how animals had changed over time as a result of domestication. So if we look, at different species, for instance, dogs, right, or cattle, or wheat, or even vegetables, right, Charles Darwin noted that a tremendous degree of change had taken place in a lot of these living things. For instance, you look at the domestic form of corn here compared to the wild version. I mean, it's scarcely recognizable. And, the pug here compared to the wolf, right? The domestic cat is remarkably still similar to its origins. But Charles Darwin was looking at this and he's saying, well, if this is the kind of change that can be brought on by artificial selection, by people intentionally breeding specific animals for specific traits, then what kind of changes can take place within the natural world? And one of the big problems, one of the big logical inconsistencies that faced Europeans at this time was the idea that, if God had created each individual species specifically and expressly all on its own, then you're faced with a remarkable quantity of diversity. There are just dozens and dozens and dozens of different species, some of which differ in minute ways. And one great example here is Darwin's finches. This was on the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin noticed that there were many different finches, many different birds, and they had beaks which differed in slight but significant ways. You can see here an illustration where, some of the birds had very large beaks, some of them had very narrow beaks, very sharp, others very short. And Darwin noted that these beaks were specifically tailored to the bird's diet. So each different version of the finch had a beak specifically adapted to help them access the food upon which they relied. Personally, I think one of my favorite examples, I just learned about this the other day, in fact, is the Galapagos tortoise. And if you look here at the tortoise on the right, you'll notice that it has a very flat shell, very dome-like shell, whereas the tortoise here on the left has a very large protrusion that extends over its neck. And what Darwin discovered is that the tortoise on the left lives on an island where food is very high up. It's a very dry environment. There's not much moisture there, and so this tortoise is forced to extend its neck upward and obtain food for branches higher above, whereas the tortoise on the right, it lives on a very fertile island, and there's an abundance of grass and leaves and greenery that grows on the ground, so this tortoise doesn't have to extend its neck upward, so that the shell of the tortoise is tailored so that the tortoise can obtain the food that it needs. Now, Charles Darwin looked at this and said, well, this is remarkable, because this really, in many ways, is similar to what we see in domesticated animals, right? These slight variations where, each species has been tailored to its environment. And so the question arises, well, did God create each of these tortoises individually and place them specifically on these islands, with the express purpose of eating the food which they rely upon? Or is, in fact, each tortoise descended from the same common ancestor, but ultimately their form has changed over time in order to suit their environment? Now, the latter option seems much more logical, right? That essentially, you have these primitive forms, these basic forms that then diversify over time. And in The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin realizes and argues that given a long enough timeline, these small variations can in fact produce radically different life forms. That, given a long enough timeline, these little changes, these little incremental changes over time can produce species of radically varying forms. And this is what he argues is natural selection. Now, one of the things that a lot of people get wrong or misinterpret is this idea of survival of the fittest. You'll hear people say this, survival of the fittest in reference to athletes. They say, well, survival of the fittest. Well, that's not what Charles Darwin meant when he said survival of the fittest. Now, the biggest, strongest, fastest animal is not necessarily the one that always survives. What fittest refers to is just simply that the animal is best suited to survive within its given environment. So if you have a big cheetah and a little tiny mouse, okay, and there's only little bugs to eat, the mouse is going to be considered fittest because the mouse is better suited to that environment. The cheetah can't live off little insects, right? So it's not about fitness in terms of speed, strength, agility. It's fitness in terms of adapting to one's environment, learning how to survive within a given environment. Now, this was quite significant because Charles Darwin's ideas relied heavily on the ideas that were put forward by Charles Lyell in his Principles of Geology, right? Charles Lyell gives Darwin this picture of the Earth that extends the timeline out into millions of years, that supplies natural selection the kind of time that it needs in order to produce the diversity of life we see in the world. Now, one of the interesting things I want to read for you guys, this is a quote by Charles Darwin. He said, "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me sick." Now, this seems like a rather strange statement, right? Most people enjoy looking at a peacock's feather, but the reason he said this is because up to this point, Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection could not account for everything we see in nature. So, for instance, the birds of paradise, that we see. I mean, the beautiful birds with these beautiful feathers, right? Or the peacock's tail, all of these different characteristics that don't supply the animal with any advantages for surviving in their given environment. Peacock's feathers are a huge disadvantage. They expend massive amounts of resources. The bird has to go to a tremendous amount of trouble to produce these things. It's actually a disadvantage. And so in his next book, The Descent of Man, Charles Darwin puts forward his theory regarding sexual selection, so that evolution over time is governed really by these two forms of selection: natural selection, which is dedicated to survival, and sexual selection, which is dedicated to what is preferred mostly by the female of the species. And in environments where you have an abundance of natural resources, natural selection is diminished and sexual selection comes up. This is why in jungles, rainforests, right, you have an abundance of food, an abundance of life, right? Here we see sexual selection taking over, where the birds, the animals, they take on these radical forms to accommodate the preferences of the female of the species. Whereas in arid environments, dry environments, lifeless environments, natural selection is going to dominate significantly. So these ideas were very compelling in the 1800s. I mean, you had a lot of people who were deeply troubled by these ideas, deeply disturbed by what it was Charles Darwin was putting forward, mostly because it made such a tremendous amount of sense, right? It was an incredibly compelling theory, and it really in many ways undermined the biblical picture of the world. Now, I want to go through a few significant events with you guys just to give you a sense of how this all played out. In 1860, a debate was held at an Oxford meeting of the British Association. Bishop Wilberforce asked Huxley if it was through his grandmother or his grandfather that he was defended from an ape.
If we are unprejudiced judges, we have to admit that there is as little interval as animals between the gorilla and the man as there is between the gorilla and the baboon. It is speech alone and not some spiritual gift that makes man a reasonable being. That is the source of our unlimited intellectual progress, but that does not disguise the fact that to the very root and foundation of his nature, man is one with the rest of the organic world. No one who has ever dissected the brain of an ape agrees with Professor Owen. His findings are wrong. I can only assume that Professor Owen's brain must have shrunk in the pickling jar. I meant, of course, the chimpanzee's brains he had examined. Oh, Lord. It was then that God delivered Wilberforce into my hands.
I wonder, Mr. Huxley, is it through your grandfather or your grandmother that you claim descent from an ape?
I stood up, very quiet, very grave, and said my say with perfect good temper. If the question is put to me, would I rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather, or a man, highly intelligent, possessed of great means of influence, and yet who employed these faculties and that influence for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave scientific discussion? I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape.
You didn't. I said that, or something very like that.
How dare you attack a live bishop in public? Have you no respect for the purple waistcoat?
Lady Brewster fainted, had to be carried from the room. And then Admiral Fitzroy got to his feet.
Fitzroy?
This! Believe in this! Believe in God, not man!
Oh, my.
Fitzroy, the captain of the Beagle, shouted over the crowd that he had warned Darwin of the dangers of his thoughts. Fitzroy committed suicide 5 years later. So Fitzroy was the captain of the Beagle, and Charles Darwin and Fitzroy would debate at length on the Beagle about these ideas of natural selection. But Fitzroy was deeply religious man, and he was very disturbed by a lot of the things that Charles Darwin was putting forward. So this caused real social shockwaves in Western civilization. In 1860, Edouard Lartet discovered these bones of extinct mammals that were engraved by human beings. Now, this was rather remarkable because at that time in European history, it was now understood that there were, in fact, these prehistoric animals, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, right, that had long since gone extinct and that belonged to an ancient era in European history, a long-lost period of ancient history. And when they discovered these bones with these engravings on them, clearly made by intelligent human beings, it was a clear and resounding piece of evidence that suggested the origins of man were probably much older than European society might have had first assumed. Then in 1878, Don Marcelino Sanz de Sotulo, I don't know how to pronounce that, but he discovers this cave Altamira in Spain. It's actually kind of a sad story. Most scientists and experts didn't believe that this cave was authentic. They thought that he had manufactured it, that he had faked it, and it wasn't until after his death that, in fact, he was vindicated, and it was shown that this was, in fact, a strong piece of evidence of man's ancient origins. So these ancient caves start being discovered around Europe, which suggests that Europeans, very, very old European cultures, were depicting these extinct life forms, right, this ice age period of history. So that, around the same period, right around the time that Charles Darwin's book is published, European society is becoming increasingly conscious of a lot of this evidence, a lot of these interesting things. Of course, at the same time, you have the colonial civilizations, right? Europeans going out, conquering distant lands. These are the Sand Bushmen of the Kalahari. You have the Native Americans of America, right? These hunter-gatherer societies, right? We have Aboriginal Australians. These are populations of people who are clearly leading a much more primitive way of life, a much more primitive lifestyle, right? They don't have, oftentimes they don't have agriculture, they don't have writing, they don't have books, they don't have, a lot of these things. So there's this sense that man, has this primitive origins, and Europeans it's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore this, right? It's becoming increasingly clear that this is in fact man's primordial state, man's primordial origins. Then in 1857, in the Neander Valley in Germany, Johann Fuhlrott discovers this skeleton of Neanderthal man, and this was a really significant thing because here was a man who was clearly human, clearly walked on two legs, resembles a human being in every way, but has these robust and primitive features, a large brow ridge over the eyes, large extended nose. It was a very strange looking creature, and people who examined the skeleton right away understood that this was perhaps some primitive form of man. And this is really where our image of caveman comes from. This was when Europeans really started to recognize this caveman origin, so to speak. So when we get into the modern era, into the 1900s, right, science really takes off, and chemistry and physics start to integrate into this debate, where uranium dating was used on the Jackson Hills in Australia to date the age of the Earth. Now, basically, the science behind this is that uranium-238 decays into lead-206 with a half-life of 4.47 billion years. And so by measuring the ratio of lead-206 to uranium-238 in a given rock sample can give you an estimate of the age of that rock. And when they used this on zircon crystals extracted from rocks in Australia, they discovered that the Earth was, 3 billion years old, that these rocks were likely, 3 to 4 billion years old. So this really cements, this is a solid measurement, a solid date that cements Charles Lyell's theory, right? Charles Lyell's principles of geology is really at this point cemented. And now, there's no doubt that the Earth is in fact this old, that we're dealing with a planet this ancient. Then, of course, in the 1960s, the first skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis is discovered by Leakey, I believe his name was, and this is famously known as Lucy. This was a remarkable discovery because Lucy was clearly ape-like in pretty much all of her features, the facial features, the brain cavity. I mean, it looks like a chimp, and yet when you look at the hips of this skeleton, this is clearly an ape that was walking upright. This is not a chimpanzee. The hip bones are shifted to resemble that of a modern human being. And this was actually, in many circles, kind of a surprise. It was a shock because it meant that the first major step in human evolution was bipedal locomotion, walking on two legs. Many people thought that perhaps it was brain development, that human beings became more intelligent first, then started walking upright. But this really proved that, in fact, the first major step towards modern Homo sapiens was bipedal locomotion, walking on two legs. Of course, since then, dozens and dozens and dozens of skeletons have been discovered, right? We have Australopithecus afarensis, anamensis, africanus. Some of these have large fins on the top of the skull that enabled these sapiens to break open nuts and extract food in this way. We get into the Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, Homo erectus. Homo erectus discovered fire. It's alongside his skeletons we see the earliest signs of fire. Homo habilis was really the first prolific tool maker. We see a significant step forward in terms of the invention of tools, the invention of axes, these sorts of things. And of course, Homo neanderthalis and Homo sapiens, which is us. And so really I want to wrap this up here. And just to give, again, this really gives us a portrait of human origins. And I want to play for you guys a few clips here. These are just selected clips from different movies that sort of show and illustrate the change in our thinking about our origins, right? Where, in the ancient world or in the medieval world, human origins were basically summed up by the book of Genesis. But now we have a much more imaginative mythology. And it's interesting how, modern science in many ways seems to suggest that, we've eliminated mythology, we've gotten mythology out of our origins, but that's simply not true. We've simply changed our mythology. We think now oftentimes in terms of, extraterrestrials or things of this kind, right? We still invent mythology, but this scientific understanding has radically impacted and evolved our perspective on our origins.
And how does one create life?
I do it with the wave of my hand. It's 1985. A gossamer sheet of vapory atmosphere thickens into an azure blanket. Harsh tundra becomes fertile savanna. Vast swaths of green spreading across the moon's arid skin like a verdant rash. A primordial ocean transmutes into a liquid creation engine. I step out onto the amniotic lake. A hatchery stocked with miracles, finned, winged, and hoofed.
You walk on water?
Occasionally, yes.
Cool. You take Sunday off when you're done?
No, the entire process is complete in approximately 90 seconds.
Typical.
I'm sorry?
A man creating life in under 2 minutes?
Oh, a sex joke. That's funny.
Thanks. So, what about Adam and Eve? You create them too?
Adam and Eve are fictional characters. On Europa, I did it for real. I knitted their bodies from the microbes in the water. 2 infants that, by virtue of accelerated biomechanical maturation, would soon become a man and a woman. I give them higher brain function, instantaneous speech, self-awareness. And then I bring them a place in which to live, a manor house.